If I were to ask you to name the three most popular drinks in the world, tea would certainly be among them. Although it became known to the Western world only 400 years ago, it was at that time that Portuguese traders brought strange leaves with a sour taste to Europe for the first time. In fact, tea started to become popular in England because in the middle of the 17th century, the Portuguese princess Catherine of Braganza married the British King Charles II, who became addicted to tea. Only the rich English aristocrats could afford to drink it for a long time because of the monopoly on pure tea. Quite expensive in the 17th century, the only world supplier of tea was China, and the only importer in Britain was a local Ossetian company. Seeing the growing demand for tea and the company's desire to break free from Chinese dependence, it began to develop plantations in Hindustan. The British overdid it a little, as India has become the world's leading tea producer. Overtaking both China and Kenya, India consumes 80% of its own tea production. Although 200 years ago, Indians were completely uninterested in this drink. Tea culture is only one of the many legacies of British companies. Yes, you heard right. There were a lot of East India companies. They were formed as national trade cartels and died as large corporations with their own armies. Their origins are linked to the era of great geographical discoveries. The final nail in their coffins was driven by industrialization and the development of industry. This is a story about how the East India companies dominated South Asia. Take a look at the main trade route of the Middle Ages, with a length of 12,800 kilometers. The Great Silk Road. 1,000 years ago, caravans with silk, spices and precious metals traveled from China through Asia to the Middle East and to the borders of the Eastern Roman Empire. At the capital of Byzantium, Constantinople, Venetian and Genoan merchants bought Oriental goods and resold them in Europe. These searches launched the era of great geographical discoveries, which forever changed world history. The Portuguese were among the first to explore these waters, away from the main trade routes of Europe, and therefore had to buy fabrics and spices at inflated prices from their more fortunate neighbors. This incentive was more than enough to motivate them, and only 45 years after the capture of Constantinople, they had achieved their goal. The search for the Portuguese was crowned with success. The navigator Vasco da Gama circumnavigated Africa from the south and reached the southwest coast of Hindustan, the peninsula that today contains India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan. The first European route to the east was established. Of course, the almost monopolistic trade with Asia has made Lisbon, the Portuguese capital, the largest wholesale boom, from where imported goods were transported throughout Europe. The details of the direct sea route from Europe to the shores of Hindustan remained a secret for a long time. Over time, merchants from Spain and the Netherlands joined in the trade, earning hundreds of % speculative returns. England stood somewhat apart from this trade, as it did not have a powerful fleet in the 16th century, and its share of trade was scanty in the economy. Cotton and spices were mainly supplied to London markets by Spanish and Dutch merchants who bartered them, in which the company planned to make good money. It not only received a monopoly on trade with South Asia, but was also exempt from many British duties and taxes. Of course, these privileges were granted for a reason. The British government turned cartels not only into a commercial institution, but also into a military one. To do this, the company was allowed to create its own fleet of ships. It was also allowed to mint its own coins and conduct diplomatic relations with local rulers. In fact, the company received a carte blanche, becoming a state within a state. As for Hindustan, it is an unexplored region, but clearly a very promising one. So, here's your flag in your hand. And we have enough problems here in Europe. Realizing that the competition was developing seriously, the Dutch created their own cartel after 2 years, and later, Denmark, Portugal, France, Austria, and even Sweden joined them. Thus, the era of the East India Company, which was the first corporation in history, began in Europe. The idea behind the East India Company was to regularly assemble expeditions to the East, bringing back scarce but desirable goods for European markets and selling them for a profit. The profitability of these expeditions in the 17th century was around 400%. However, it is easier said than done. Firstly, sending a ship costs about 100,000 guilders. By comparison, the famous artist Rembrandt bought a whole house in the center of Amsterdam in the early 17th century for just 13,000. Secondly, not every ship returns home. the ship was caught in storms and attacked by competitors and pirates. Expeditions would take 10 years due to organizational problems. A trading trip to Hindustan had high risks and profitability, but no one wanted to take the risks alone. On average, over 200 years, the Dutch cartel shares brought investors 18% annually. In the early years after the formation of national cartels, England and the Netherlands conducted an intelligence policy in Asia, establishing trade relations with the local population. At the same time, the Dutch company was the obvious leader in the region. Of course, there were clashes between competitors, which, of course, exacerbated the tension between the countries due to the superiority of the Dutch company. Clearly, something had to be done. So, in October 1651, the English Parliament decided that from then on, all goods should be imported into England only by English ships. Thus, the Crown supported the development of the national fleet and prevented the Dutch from earning money on the British market. Of course, trade with the British was not the main source of income for the Netherlands, but this new law allowed English pirates to capture Dutch ships in their own waters, which was the largest empire at the time. The connection between the headquarters in Amsterdam and local managers in Asia was difficult. Local staff thought only of how to loot more. When the competitors were eliminated, things could not have gone better for the British company. Its bonds provided excellent returns, and the company itself contributed up to 10% of the tax revenues of the British Treasury. To understand where these financial results came from, we need to look at how people lived in Hindustan. In many ways, the enormous profits of the British were facilitated by the fragmentation of local rulers. The Nawabs? Constant conflicts between the Nawabs made their rule unstable, and so many turned to a powerful British company for help in exchange for a fee and trading privileges. The British had no objection to helping local rulers achieve their political goals. And if in the 17th century, cartels had to spend money on military expenses, by the end of the 18th century, local people largely paid for the upkeep of the army of the East India Company. In fact, military expenses in the metropolis were funded by the colonial treasury. Some Nawabs, of course, were wayward guys and resisted expansion. But then local merchants entered the fray. They simply bribed troops to take over the Nawabs, because there were too many deals linked to the British company, and merchants would lose such a lucrative trading partner. Approximately, such a story happened in Bengal, a large region in South Asia, in 1757. The Nawab of Bengal decided to prevent the strengthening of trading posts in Calcutta. But eventually, the trading post was strengthened and a new ruler was placed on the throne. This consistent trade and military policy led to the British company monopolizing the market by the beginning of the 19th century, with all the associated consequences. Hundreds of thousands of local artisans were forced to sell their products to British factories at minimal prices. This forced closed-circuit trading has led to terrible consequences, such as the company's active export of Indian textiles that were popular in Europe in the beginning. But when the domestic industry began to develop in Britain, the Crown did not just impose protective duties on imports of fabrics so that domestic manufacturers would not have competition. Instead, it completely banned exports of Indian textiles in order to protect sales markets in metropolitan areas. This led to such widespread poverty that in 1834, the British Governor-General wrote to London that the plains of India were turning white with the bones of weavers who had starved due to poverty. Other sectors of the economy have also been severely affected. To make way for the cultivation of opium poppies, which the company was selling illegally in China, rice and grain crops were destroyed in India. As a result, people simply started to starve, and one of the biggest famine epidemics ever to break out in Bengal in the 1770s took the lives of 10 million people. This could not last long, and in the 19th century, popular uprisings began to break out regularly in the possessions of the British company. The metropolitan government was greatly concerned. Of course, the British authorities' attention to the company's activities was drawn not only by public unrest, the Crown was even more concerned that by 1830, the British East India Company controlled regions with a population of over 100 million people, with Bengal alone having 4 times as many inhabitants as England and Wales combined. Fabulously wealthy employees of the company in India have begun to return to their homelands and bid for seats in the British Parliament. in the House of Commons in 1790. There were 45 deputies out of a total of 558 members, which greatly annoyed the aristocrats. Finally, many British industrialists complained to Parliament about imports of Indian goods that were stifling domestic production. So, it is not surprising that since the end of the 18th century, the authorities have consistently weakened the cartel by imposing huge duties and limiting its monopoly rights. As a result, the company gradually transformed from a profitable enterprise into a company that was loaned money from the government. Hell, who needs a loss-making company in the long-term perspective of British economic development? The cartel ceased to exist by the middle of the 19th century, and the uprising of Indian sepoy soldiers in colonial India was the final straw that broke the authorities' patience. In 1858, the British Parliament started bankruptcy proceedings that lasted 16 years, and in 1856, India came under direct control of the Crown. However, before gaining independence, the country had almost a century left to go. The East India Company dominated Hindustan for over 200 years and built railways and telegraph lines during this time. The Europeans became agents of education, thanks to which a new class of Indian elite emerged, which played a decisive role in Indian independence movements. The East India Companies introduced world trade and had accumulated vast experience in corporate governance, forming the basis of modern management principles. But at what cost did this experience come? The ruinous policies of cartels led to the deterioration of crafts and agriculture. Tens of millions of Indians died from hunger and military conflict as a result of the East India expansion. Without any doubt, the long-term colonial policy in modern times is one of the main reasons why India remains one of the poorest countries in Asia today.